in Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12. If you were here with us last week, we introed the beginning of a very big story. And it's the story of a man named Abram. And remember, the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, the origin of the universe and creation, the flood narrative, which is like the recreation of earth, all of that, 11 chapters in Genesis. The next 14 chapters are about one guy's life. So that's an important guy. His name's Abram. Here, he becomes Abraham. His wife, Sarai, she becomes Sarah. So I'm going to get that out of the way right now. Please forgive me. They're still Abram and Sarai, but I will most certainly call them Abraham and Sarah. Just know those are interchangeable, but technically that's not their names yet. So just bear with me. It's kind of hard to keep those straight. Well, last week we talked about him. We talked about God calling him to leave his home country and to go to a country that God would tell him about. And God then makes him a promise, a covenant. And just real briefly in chapter 12, because this is really important, it continues to be important. Here's what he tells him. I'll make you a great nation. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great. You'll be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you. I'll curse those who curse you. And all people on earth will be blessed through you. That's the promise that God makes in Genesis chapter 12 in these first 9 verses to Abram. And so verse 4 says, so Abraham went. So you see our patriarch of faith, the father of faith, Abram, exhibiting that first sign of faith. God called him, God made a promise, and he goes. And so last week we talked about the faith of Abraham, how he's mentioned 351 times in the Bible. He's in 11 of 27 New Testament books mention Abram or Abraham. And so, wow, the faith of Abraham, it's incredible. Well, we turn immediately now, still in chapter 12 and verse 10, from the faith of Abraham and the calling of Abraham to the failure of Abraham or failure of Abram. After that great moment, we got a mountaintop experience. We have Abram called. God makes his promise. Abram responds in faith and he goes. And it's that going that a lot of these New Testament authors pick up on as a sign of his great faith. He knew very little about God, and yet he trusted him. When God called him to go, he went. But now we have a story of failure. You can't really spell it any different than that. It's a story of failure on the part of Abram. But let's give him a little bit of grace. Maybe what we're seeing is the development of his great faith. He's very young in his faith, He's really early in this thing, so maybe we cut him a little bit of slack here. Well, join me there in verse 10. We read this story of Abram and Sarai in Egypt. So 10 through 20, pretty straightforward. Here's what it says. There was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while because the famine in the land was severe. And when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife, Sarai, look, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but let you live. Please say you're my sister, so it will go well for me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh. So the woman was taken to Pharaoh's household. He treated Abram well because of her. And Abram acquired flocks and herds and male and female donkeys, male and female slaves and camels. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh sent for Abram and said, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? So I took her as my wife. Now, here's your wife. Take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave his men orders about him, and they sent him away with his wife and all he had. So, what starts this story is a famine in the land, a severe famine, and it's so bad that they have to decide to pick up everything they have and go to a different country. They had to travel quite far to leave really the Middle East and go to what we call Africa today, where the nation of Egypt is, and because of a severe famine. You know, it's interesting that it's in these severe circumstances that it's often hardest to exhibit faith. It's easy to have faith at church. It's easy to have faith in good circumstances, but when the rubber meets the road and the circumstances get difficult, that's when our faith is challenged the most, isn't it? When you're thinking about how are you going to feed your family, that'll challenge your faith. That'll stretch the old faith muscle out a little bit. And that's the problem here. Things are bad. There is a famine. What are we going to do? We're going to starve to death if we don't pick up and leave. It's those circumstances that bring us to this story. That's bring them to Egypt. God, though, has told Abram to go to Canaan. He went to Canaan, and the very next story is him going to Egypt. And so he's on a journey, and we have to kind of decide if that was a good choice or not. He's going to seek refuge, seek food in Egypt. Most commentators believe it's because of the Nile River, really. The Nile River Valley where everything grows and is prosperous there. If there's a drought, then there'd probably still be food along the Nile River. They'd be able to water and irrigate crops. But we have a kind of a theme here, seeking refuge in Egypt. We see this over and over in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and the New Testament as well. Think about it for a minute. Abram and Sarai, they go. Jacob and his sons, you know, Joseph's there, and there's a famine in the land, and so Jacob sends his sons, and eventually all of Israel's people, Israel and his son and all of his descendants, they move to Egypt to escape a famine. They spend 400 years there. After they leave Egypt, remember they're in the wilderness, you have that period of 40 years we call the wilderness wanderings, and it's in that period that they often are trying to do what? Go back to Egypt. Escape, whatever their circumstance is, in the desert, to go back into Egypt. And then also, you have in the New Testament, you know, King Herod is out to kill the little boys. God warns Joseph in a dream to get up and go, and they flee to where? They flee to Egypt. So it's kind of this theme. But sometimes it's a good thing to go to Egypt, and sometimes it's not in the Bible. So it's not always a bad thing. You know, of course, God tells you to go, then you should go. You know, when they're trying to go back after God told them to leave, then that's a bad thing. Or I think Abram and Sarai going here is a bad thing. I think it's a bad thing. What you see in this 10-chapter section is a scared patriarch. Isn't it? He leaves Canaan. Why? He's scared of dying. I mean, he doesn't want to starve to death. There's a famine. He's going to lie to Pharaoh. Why? He's scared of dying. He's scared. And so when you're operating out of fear, you can be almost certain that you're not operating out of faith. If fear is driving your decisions, then you're not living in faith. Now, you can have fear and live in faith. It's just what is the basis on which you're making the decisions that are directing the course of your life? Is it that fear or is it faith? And so, you got a little faithless moment here, I think. But as I mentioned, you know, he's brand new. I mean, he's a brand new believer at this point. I mean, he's just made that first step of faith to go. And now he's in this situation. I think oftentimes, you know, we might, if those of us who have been saved for a little while, been walking with the Lord for a little while, see someone stumbling along their faith journey, and we might be tempted to look down on them, might be tempted to judge them, but the truth is they just might not be where we're at. They may be immature in their faith, and that's certainly the case here. I think he's immature in his faith, and what it takes to become more faithful is to choose faith in difficult circumstances more and more. We could go around the room tonight and have testimonies about moments in your life that increased your faith. And I bet you a lot of those would be going through difficult times, things you didn't want to have to go through. And yet you trusted the Lord through those times, and he saw you through to the other side. And your faith grew. And then when the next challenge came, you figured out you had a little bit more faith to handle that situation because of the last situation you got through. And so if faith is like a muscle, you got to work it out. But how do you work out a muscle? You tear it down. And it's hard, but it grows back stronger. And so I think that is the case here with Abram. I think he's having a case of spiritual immaturity, not trusting the Lord yet. I mean, why is he scared of dying? God just told him, what? I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to make you, you can't be a great nation if you die of starvation. You can't be a great nation if you die in Egypt. God's made him a promise. Why is he scared of what the Egyptians will do? God has promised what? I'll bless those who bless you, and I'll curse those who curse you. I mean, if you believe that promise that God's made him, you shouldn't be afraid of people. And yet he is. Yet he is. So let's talk about that. Two things he does, I think he does wrong. First of all, he leaves the promised land. Second of all, he lies about his wife, Sarai. However, when you read this, a lot of commentators disagree. A lot of them do. And you'll find them on both sides pretty well split, it seems. Some of them say he was wrong for leaving the promised land, and some say he was not wrong for leaving, maybe right for leaving the promised land in this situation. And so this is the kind of thing we don't talk about in sermons because we don't have time. But in a Bible study like this, we can dig into the details. And I like to do this. I like to tell you the different options here, different viewpoints, because I think it makes you think a little bit deeper. It's easy just to come and hear, let's be more faithful. I'm going to go home and be more faithful. But it's better to dig in, I think. Don't you think? I enjoy it if you don't. Just know I'm having fun, okay? All right. Here's the discussion. Did Abram do what was right because he did the wise thing? He left a place that couldn't feed his family and went to a place that had food. Some commentators say that's prudent. That's wise. That is even shrewd to make a right decision there to go to a place that could get you food. So, like I said, there's a little bit. And they would say this. Listen, he wasn't being faithless. He was just going there for a little while. It says that. He went to Egypt to stay for a while, or your translation might say, and this is a good word for this, to sojourn. Sojourn means a temporary visit there. It doesn't mean you are relocating permanently. And so they'd say, listen, he just went there for a little while because there was a famine, but he was going to go back to Canaan. So maybe that's the case. Maybe he did the wise thing and then just temporarily went to Egypt. I don't know, though, because if the circumstance is such in Egypt that it's going to risk their life, you know, what's better, to die in Egypt because, you know, they think they can marry your wife, or to die in Canaan where God called you to go of starvation? You know, I mean, it's kind of tomato. At least you're going to be where God called you to go if you're going to die. So that's where I really line up, but there is a little bit of discussion there on that. Well, it's on this trip. It's on this trip that Abe comes up with a plan, a deceitful plan, and his plan is that when they get to Egypt, they're going to lie. And they're going to say that his wife is actually his sister. Now, remember, we're Old Testament, okay? Long time ago. Remember, we're not that long after the flood and all that. And so here's the thing about that lie. It's technically not a lie, because this is actually his wife and his half-sister, okay? We can kind of collectively go, ooh, you know. They have the same father, different mother. All right, that's just what they did back then. It's just kind of weird. All right, it's weird for us now. It wasn't weird for them. And so that's his basis, right? Well, I mean, I'm not technically lying. I mean, she is my sister. You can hear him justifying that to himself or to others. And that's what we would call a half-truth. Isn't that true? Half-truth. And a half-truth is used to cover up the whole truth. A half-truth is a lie. Anybody want to argue? All right, right. When you take the witness stand, I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, right? Because they know there's people like Abraham out there that will say, well, technically I didn't perjure myself. I told part of the truth. No, you make an oath to tell the whole truth, right? And that's what he does. I'm gonna finagle it just a little bit and tell part of the truth. And that way I'm not really lying. You ever find yourself in that situation? You want to spare somebody's feelings, maybe? You want to spare your own feelings? You want to spare your own circumstances, your own situation? You want to weasel out of something? Well, technically, this is true. But is it completely true? And if not, then it's a lie. It's deceit. And it's wrong. It's immoral. And we know that to be true. So that's what he does. Hey, listen, I got this plan. When we get there, here's what we're going to do. And so there's ethical dilemmas all throughout this story, right? What is the right thing to do? What's the right thing for Abram to do? Here's another question. What's the right thing for Sarai to do? I mean, what's the biblical thing for her to do? Should she go along with this plan? I mean, should she submit to her husband's leadership when he tells her to do something immoral? Oof. You don't hear much of a protest from her, and I know let's be fair to her, the status of women in those days was not what it is today and what it should be, what it is today. To be able to disagree with her husband is probably not real kosher, but nevertheless, I would say no. I mean, submission is a issue of authority, right? The Bible says, wives, submit to your husbands. However, all of us are supposed to submit most assuredly to the Lord. He is our primary authority. And here's the example you've probably heard me use before. If the CEO of the company comes to your job and tells you to do something, and then the manager at your job tells you to do something else, who are you going to listen to? The one with the most authority, right? That's what you listen to, the boss. Well, God is the boss. So if you're going to submit, then all of that has to be run through. First of all, my first priority, my first allegiance is not to my husband, it's to my God. And so she seems to go along with this plan, whether she liked it or not. She probably shouldn't have done that. Should Abram have lied to save his life? Is it okay to lie to save our lives? That's tricky, isn't it? That's a tough one in the Bible. Think about Rahab the prostitute. What did she do in order to save the two spies? She lied. She misled the men of Jericho that were looking for the spies, and she's counted faithful for doing that, for choosing to save their lives, and by the way, the lives of her whole family by misleading these men. So is Abram faithful, faithless? I think faithless. In this situation. And so let's keep going. I mean, I think it's easy to say we see Abram being a coward. He's afraid. He's afraid of dying. And so what he's going to do is he's going to use his wife's dignity and her integrity and her purity as a shield to defend his own life. He's essentially saying to Pharaoh and anybody else, take my wife, don't take me. Gentlemen, let us never be the kind of men that would sacrifice our loved ones to protect ourselves. We ought to be the opposite kind of men, right? We ought to be the men that sacrifice ourselves to save our loved ones, not them to save us. If we're going to love our wives as Christ loved the church, what did Christ do for the church? He took the cross for her sins, not his. He sacrificed himself for her. That's the picture of what a Christian man is, a godly man is. And as much as we want to talk about equality and stuff in this world, the truth is when bad things happen, and I mean really bad things happen, the old adage, women and children first, is no longer offensive. It's back in style all of a sudden. And that's how it should be all the time. We should value the lives of women and children, those that God entrusts to us over our own life. You see Abram doing the exact opposite. He's valuing his own life over his wife and her integrity, her purity, her dignity. Well, the reason why is because old Sarai was a knockout. Right? I mean, do you get the picture here? He's like, listen, babe, you are really attractive. And you hear that and you think, oh, he's buttering her up for something. You know what I mean? Like, okay, where's this going? But then even they get to Egypt, and it says Pharaoh's officials saw her and reported her beauty to Pharaoh, the monarch of Egypt, right? I mean, that says a lot. By the way, Sarai, 65 years old at this point in her life. She had it going on. Legendary beauty. That's the picture. All right? The Hebrew word here for beautiful is translated smoking hot. Just kidding. Just kidding. So, I mean, just her beauty is noteworthy. People noticed. I mean, it was evident, which means she might have even been half as pretty as my wife, Alyssa. Listen, I stay in trouble, as you can imagine, so I got to bank some of this, when the opportunity presents itself. And so that's the plan. They got this plan together. Listen, your beauty, they're going to want to marry you, and if they think I'm your brother, they'll be nice to me. If they think I'm your husband, they'll kill me to marry you. I guess that's how it worked back then. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because if you're willing to kill a lady's husband in order to marry her, it makes sense you'd kill her brother too. I don't know why that's different, but that's apparently what maybe the Egyptians had a reputation for killing guys to marry their wife. I don't know, but that's what he's scared of. And her beauty is noticed, and you have this lusty monarch, the Pharaoh, who does take her into his home. And I guess, if you're the guy in charge, you have the privilege to do that. I don't think we see, and that's verse 15, that's what it just says. Pharaoh officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, so the woman was taken to Pharaoh's household. And I mean, you just don't hear any protests there. You would think you would. You would think Abram would say something there, do something. But I mean, it just seems like he says, see you, honey, have a good time. I mean, you know what I mean? He just doesn't protest. There's no word said. It's just crazy. And so then, look at verse 16. It says he gets rich off of this. Abram was treated well because of her. Because he did this, he acquired flocks, herds, donkeys, slaves, camels. He gets rich. There's a famine going on in his home country, and he's in Egypt getting rich. Well, how's he getting rich? Well, it's all adults in here. He essentially pimps out his wife. Right? This is Wednesday night. That's right. So, I mean, gosh, he's rewarded for his unrighteous behavior. He profits off the purity of his wife by sending her to Pharaoh's house. So, goes to show you, just because a person has wealth or possessions doesn't mean they're necessarily blessed and righteous in their actions. They might have acquired it like this guy did, in an ill-gotten fashion. Oftentimes, you do see wealth accompany wisdom. Proverbs talks a lot about that. That the wise grow wealthy. But not always. And oftentimes, like we talked about last week, calling will play into that. Somebody could be wise, faithful, following God, and God's called them to a career field where they'll never be wealthy. You know, if you're called to be a teacher, for example, you're not going to get rich doing that. If you're called to be a preacher and you do it right, now you can write a bunch of books and thump people on the forehead, but that's something else. You're probably never going to get rich doing that, but God might call you. So oftentimes that's the case, that riches follow wisdom, but not always. But on the other side of that, sometimes people are broke because they make bad decisions. So there's not a direct correlation between possessions and God's blessing, possessions and wisdom. Sometimes there is a correlation, sometimes there is not. But here's a good picture of that. He gets wealthy right here doing something that we would all agree is immoral and really an abomination. And so this is the best part. You should underline this if you're an underliner. Verse 17. But the Lord. But the Lord. You didn't think that God didn't notice this, did you? You didn't think God had abdicated his responsibility or his throne in order to go on a vacation or something. No, God is very present here. And I want to say this. This story is not about Abram and Sarai or Pharaoh. This is a story about God. The main point here is about God, not about Abram or Sarai or the Pharaoh. Those are supporting cast in this story about God. And let me go a little further with that. That's true about the entire Bible. How does the Bible, and therefore the book of Genesis, begin? In the beginning, God. This is a story about God. Now, he uses people and people are involved. There's human characters. And we're human characters. And so we put ourselves in their position and we see it from their perspective. But understand, this is not a story about people. It's not a story about you and me. It's a story about God. And we learn probably most here about God. Like I said, we can think about the ethical dilemmas that are presented, and they're very much present, and things we have to deal with perhaps, but the story is about God. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife, Sarai. We see already God keeping up part of his covenant. And it's this: I'll bless those who bless you. I'll curse those who curse you. And the picture is that Abram and Sarai are going to be a great nation. That can't happen if Sarai's in Pharaoh's house. So God has a purpose and a plan for these two individuals, and their sinfulness threatens the purposes and plan of God, and yet God still acts. He jumps in here. He comes to Sarai's rescue and Abram's rescue. They are faithless, but God is faithful. There is right there. But the Lord. He struck Pharaoh with plagues. Plagues in Egypt. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? We'll see that again. It's coming up. So, it's interesting. It's interesting. You understand how God feels about this situation. You understand that God is still present, active, and involved. You understand, by the way, how he feels about adultery and sexual immorality by jumping into this situation, by striking Pharaoh. And I just believe that, Pharaoh was struck. I mean, if God strikes you, I think you've been struck, and that's what takes place, because somehow, Pharaoh realizes the reason why he's had all these plagues in his house. And we don't know how. He might just put two and two together. God might have revealed it to him. We don't know. But it's wild. This story is wild in the sense that you have Pharaoh being more faithful to the covenant with God that God's made to Abraham than Abram is. He's more faithful than the father of faith, the patriarch, Abram. He rebukes this godless, wicked Pharaoh, rebukes Abram. the father of faith, the patriarch of the Israelites. And he's more faithful than Abram. It's just crazy. Why'd you do this to me? He figures it out. You didn't tell me she was your wife. Why'd you say she's my sister? And so that I took her as my wife. And I want to point out there, I took her as my wife. Okay? Let's don't lose the gravity of this situation. She wasn't just hanging out in the palace, okay? And this is what Abram did with his deceitful plan. And he's rebuked by a godless Pharaoh of Egypt. And you got to imagine the Israelites hearing this story after they came out of the Exodus, as Moses pens these words. Well, that's got to strike. The Pharaoh is the good guy here. Abram's the bad guy. It's just crazy when you think about it. But, the application I think for us is this. When we act immorally, when we act deceitfully and lost people, notice this. And if it's the case that lost people have to call us who have a moral standard, who have the Holy Spirit living in us, and we've been saved by the grace of God, when lost people have to call us out on our sin, what a terrible testimony that is. Do you think Abram could have witnessed to this Pharaoh at this point? Probably not. Probably not. The Bible says, be careful how you act towards outsiders. Let it never be that lost people have to call us on the words that come out of our mouth or the actions they catch us doing or whatever it might be. And so, he kicks him out. That's what happens. Here's your wife, take her and go. He doesn't ask him to leave. He says he gave men orders about him, and they sent him away with his wife. He gets escorted out of Egypt to head back to the land of Canaan. And once again, Pharaoh understands this blessing that God has given him. He lets him go with all the stuff he'd acquired there, with the camels and the donkeys and the slaves and all that stuff. He lets him go with that. Why? Because God says, I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Pharaoh's already experienced half of that. He's already experienced the curse. He don't want to be on that end again, so he's going to send him with all the stuff because he wants to be blessed. And so I think we see some stuff here. Once again, it's easy to kind of dog on Abram for his decisions and what he did here, but he's young in his faith. And here's the other thing. You know what? He's just like you and me in this sense. He's not perfect. He's not perfect. If you're looking for perfect people in the Bible, you only find them in one person named Jesus. Apart from that, all the other ones are messed up, just like you're messed up and I'm messed up. Just like you have sin and you stumble and you do things wrong. You have faithless moments. Well, we see them in the patriarchs as well. They're people like you and me. And here's what's great. God is still going to use Abram. God is still going to bless Abram. He made a horrible decision. He's acted unfaithfully. And God hasn't written him off. And that's true for you too, You've made some decisions that you'd probably wish you hadn't. You've had moments where you wish you'd been faithful, but you took matters into your own hands and tried to do it your way instead of God's way. And listen, God knows. God still loves you. God forgives you. God can still use you. He can. He can. Good news. Abe's not perfect, just like you're not perfect. That's good news, and God still uses him. And I think here's maybe the big thing here. Here's the big thing. God, in this little section, these 10 chapters, proves himself to be faithful even when his people are faithless. God is still faithful. God isn't absent. He's still working according to his promise. His feelings aren't hurt because of what Abe's done and his deceit and his immorality. He's still going to do what he said he's going to do. He's still holding up his side of the covenant. And here's what's true for us tonight as well. God is faithful, even when we are faithless. God is faithful. I'm going to give you one example of that from the New Testament. Here it is. But God proves his own love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God made provision for our sins while we were faithless. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. God is faithful, and Abram is going to be faithful. He's not quite there, but he's getting there. May we not follow his example of unfaithfulness, but let us learn from his moments, his stumbles, to increase our faith, so that when we go through difficult moments, our faith can be stronger, not weaker. Let us learn from these examples that the Bible doesn't spare us of, but that gives us in order that we might be strengthened as well.